Welcome to the second installment in Spencer Hess's series on radical liberalism, Gone to Seed, which launches with a critical review of Kaitlin Curtice's book, Native.
Well, hello again. This is Spencer Hess coming at you with a second episode on Kaitlin B. Curtice's Native. We'll be making headway in the belonging subtitled section of the book and also talking about this book's primary theoretical shortcoming from my perspective. Lori wanted me to make it crystal clear that the importance of what I'm talking about here flows from the fact that Kaitlin B. Curtice, I'm arguing, is representative of how 25 to 75% of the American population thinks. Not in the particulars about we need to confront white supremacist systems and be left liberals, but in the sense that in her worldview, that we're all individuals that come together and the aggregation of all our beliefs create systems that then help people that are in harmony with those systems and hurt people that are in disharmony with those systems. And why this grinds my gears is that if that is an incorrect analysis of how social and political and economic realities work, then, perforce, everything flowing from it is a waste of time. At least if the point of thinking and talking about all this is to actually change systems. Now, she can sidestep that and say, well, actually, it's about spiritual development, or it's about self-fulfillment, or it's about building community. Okay. So, without further ado, I have a disclaimer that I had an epiphany over the past week, which is that I know I claimed in the last episode that I know how Kaitlin B. Curtice identifies, but have only the vaguest sense of how or to what or to whom she belongs, or what her rediscovery of God means. Actually, she does say how and to whom she belongs. And she does lay out what her rediscovery of God means. I just don't find either of them all that persuasive. But again, just to briefly reiterate, she identifies as a Potawatomi woman first and a Christian second. And she belongs to her Potawatomi tribe. And how does she know that she belongs? From what I can tell, partially because she is an officially enlisted citizen in the Potawatomi Nation. And also because her ancestors granted her a revelation while she was out walking in nature as to the horrors her people suffered during the colonization and settlement period of American history, where her people were pushed out of their native lands and onto reservation. So therefore, in a way, I would argue is akin or adjacent to the way Christians believe they are incorporated into the mystical body of Christ, or different schools of esotericism will talk about like group souls and the spirit of a people. She's claiming that she is incorporated into her people on those bases. And my confusion as to, but she doesn't like live with her tribe, she doesn't seem to do all that much with her tribe, is irrelevant because she is participating in this higher metaphysical reality of her people, is at least her claim. I wonder if one of her German, let's say, I don't know what European people she's descended from, but if her German ancestors had come to her through the medium of the forest and told her to revive the worship of Thor or Wotan or something and get back to the old ways, would she have gone that way? I don't know. But you see how problematic this logic is, I trust. She writes in her book that in my own mixed identity of being an indigenous woman and a Christian, a descendant of European people, but also belonging to my tribe, I struggle with what it means to belong in many spaces, how to acknowledge my own whiteness, how to fight against its implications in the world, and how to use it to dismantle systems of hate. There are many people in between people who walk in liminal spaces with an acknowledgement that all of life is a complex struggle, but one we should not handle alone. She really likes this idea of liminality, which in its most abstract form just means about inhabiting a mixed space between two opposed or different realities. So that could be, ecologically speaking, an edge realm where like a forest abuts up against a plain. Or a beach is an example where land and ocean meet. But it can also be, in her case, where whiteness and European descent is mixed up with being indigenous. And she likes this idea enough that her Substack page is literally called the Liminality Journal, where she talks about all the complexity going on inside of her and outside of her. But again, she's saying a lot of words and then making rather subtle claims. So she's descended from European people, but she also belongs to her tribe. And where I got hung up reading this is, well, don't you belong to your European descendants too? Or no, because they don't have a tribal structure? Or because European is a sort of motley collection of different ethnicities, so you're just descended from them, but you especially belong to your tribe. I mentioned before my question of if her German ancestors had come to her, would that have been invalid? I also wonder to what extent is all of this secondary to she, as an individual, gives assent to identifying as a Native American woman. Again, she's vague enough where my mind runs riot, and perhaps it truly is exhaustively the case that she politically is a card-carrying member of the tribe and metaphysically communes with the ancestors. So that's that. And all these other questions are irrelevant. And speaking of her tribe, I stumbled upon an article on her tribe's official website, published several years before this book came out. And just as a different perspective on what I'm saying on this book, compressed into a couple paragraphs, I wanted to share the interview they did with her. They asked her, "How are you involved with the tribe despite living so far away?" And she says, "When I was young, my father worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but as a teen and into my 20s, I didn't have a lot of connection to Potawatomi culture. Now as an adult, I'm learning the Potawatomi language online with my sons. Because we live so far from Oklahoma and other tribal members, it's been difficult to stay connected. I read the Hanukkah when I can, and I'm so grateful it's available, and I stay updated with the tribe on social media. I've begun learning a lot more about my heritage, but my grandparents have all passed, so I'm working with a few other family members to learn more." And they ask, "How has being Potawatomi impacted your life?" Quote, "Being Potawatomi impacts every part of my life. I've written about how my life is not split up into categories, that the full circle of who I am is connected to every other part that I am, which means that who I am as a Potawatomi woman affects who I am as a mother, a wife, a friend, a worship leader, and especially as a Christian. I am so grateful to be a part of a community from afar. We are daily trying to engage in Native cultural practices, but it's certainly difficult without having a network of Natives around us. The events at Standing Rock really affected me and caused me to dig even deeper into learning about our culture and encouraging my boys to grow into their own love of our culture. I was interviewed on WABE, Atlanta's NPR station, to talk about how Standing Rock affected me as an Indigenous woman, and I'm so proud to represent our tribe in that way." Now, I'm treading on thin ice here, because if I were some sort of alt-right edgelord, me saying this would be an attempt to question her identity or belittle her. But I'm trying to, in good faith, understand what it means to have an identity and to fully belong to anything. And I really care about this because I too share with her a concern about how we got to where we are, what we're doing, and where we're headed. And these questions of how we organize ourselves are very important. But if you recall one of the slides from last week where she quotes Daniel Heath Justice, a Cherokee activist, saying that the simple fact of DNA relation isn't actually kinship, or at least not entirely. To be a good relative, to be fully kin, we must put that relatedness into thoughtful and respectful practice, individually and collectively, and take up our responsibilities to one another and to the world of which we're a part. And it seems to me that Kaitlin B. Curtice does think that learning the language with her kids and reading the tribal newspaper and following the tribe on social media and beginning to learn about your ancestors and trying to engage in quote-unquote native cultural practices in the midst of a metropole and being really affected by what happened at Standing Rock and bearing witness to that affect on a local NPR program does in fact represent being a good relative and fully kin, she seems to think. As well as, one of the central things of this book, standing up to systems and groups that are opposed to your tribal commitments. And this brings us to something I couldn't give this talk without talking about, because the biggest enemy that she poses isn't individual white people. She's too clever for that by half. Her real enemy are the system that oppress people. She writes that while I believe we should be gentle with one another, we must speak the truth. And the truth is that our church systems, social systems, and our government systems run with white supremacy coursing through their veins. Just as we remember our creation stories, we have to remember the creation story of America, the land that was built on the backs of indigenous and black bodies, the America that has abused some and upheld the sheer success of others. Race is a construct, as Lisa Sharon Harper writes, quote, "Race is about power, in biblical terms, dominion. As a political construct, race was created by humans to determine who can exercise power within a governing structure, to guide decisions regarding how to allocate resources." I want to read that last part again, because this is the only time she gestures at how systems actually work. Because after this discussion on page 35, we've got another 150-ish pages where we're just going to talk about white supremacist systems, oppressive systems, mean systems. And therefore, she takes it for granted why these things exist. She focuses on the who that I've highlighted here in red. As a political construct, race was created by humans to determine who can exercise power within a governing structure to guide decisions regarding how to allocate resources. And because she puts the emphasis on who, we just know it's all run by white males so that white males can have more stuff. And therefore, she can't grasp the tragedy, which is why I'm committed to a Marxian analysis. She can't grasp the tragedy that actually it's worse than capitalism works out well for straight white males. It actually doesn't even work all that well for them in mass in the long run. Ultimately, it undermines even that base. But this is all very complicated and confusing. And so it's not talked about. We don't talk about race in an actual structural way. So what she does is she says, oh yes, race is structural. We need to talk about systems. And then it's, well, let's just name these systems and take for granted that they work for the benefit of straight white people. So we get to hear about systems of whiteness and cultures and systems of whiteness, systems of racism, systems of race, systems of Christian colonization, settler colonial systems, systems of empire and colonization, systems of oppression and erasure, systems of oppression that leave out the most vulnerable among us, that ignore and seclude indigenous people and pay no mind to what justice might actually look like. toxic systems we continue to see upholding the power of white supremacy today. White supremacist systems within the church, systems of toxic patriarchy, systems of homophobia, systems of ableism, systems of destructive mental health practices and stigmas, systems of terrorizing the earth, institutional systems of hate, systems of oppression after oppression which are stacked against us, systems of abuse that take up space all over the world, systems of oppression and dispossession, systems that continue oppressive cycles, systems of dehumanization, systems built on worship, bullying, hate. And now for my top 5 systems she names. The system of self-care, the vast, beautiful, and complex systems of sexuality we are born with, systems of abstinence, systems of humanity that we have created to destroy the land, systems of colonial settler oppression, systems of toxic patriarchy and capitalist greed that give no care to the land. As you read this, at least in me, it enacted this sort of slow eroding of a prejudice I had that I knew what a system was. Over time, you're left in the state where it's like, what even is a system? What do they do? What does it mean to have a system of self-care? To have beautiful systems of sexuality that we are born with? What is a system of abstinence? And look, again, as I say this, a Republican could be listening to this and be like, yeah, it's all ridiculous, isn't it? But the rational kernel of what she's saying is we are destroying the land. We are oppressing people. These systems that do, in fact, do what she's talking about are a problem. But she's making a crucial mistake that the means through which these systems act are the ends themselves, instead of a necessary byproduct or fuel that, I'll grant her, does not burn clean, and that is awful, but nevertheless are not the point. And a system, in case any of you were wondering, according to Oxford, is a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism or an interconnecting network, or a set of principles or procedures according to which something is done, an organized framework or method. So when she writes about the system of abstinence, she's complaining about how the intersection of Christian morality and patriarchy create schools of thought and social rituals that indoctrinate young women into how abstinence is good and how promiscuity is bad. And this is an example of how systems oppress women because it makes promiscuous women feel bad and or influences their decisions when really they should just be free to do whatever they want with their body. In 182 pages, we get 90 instances of the word system, which comes out to once every 2 pages. Contrastingly, identity is used 89 times. Belonging is used 56 times. God's used about 104 times. But in all this, she uses the word capitalism only just 4 times, and usually with modifiers like capitalist greed or capitalistic empire, which to me is, again, muddying the waters. Because from a Marxian standpoint, the greed is, yes, a means how internally capitalism functions, but it is fueled by more than that. It's fueled by a large mass of the population that doesn't own any property and has to sell its labor power on the market in competition with each other. It's fueled by capitalists needing to bring in more money to service their debts all the time, just as 2 examples. And capitalistic empire, how does this differ from classical empires? And how does this differ from international capital? This book is not addressing that, which is fine, but she's brought the whole subject up. And so this is all bad theorizing, I think, for a few reasons. 1, it's just bad writing and thinking. 2, it mystifies how systems actually work. All over the place, she's committing reification, which is when you treat something that's abstract as this material reality that functions on its own. And we'll get more into this later. She does a lot of magical thinking, where she thinks that by naming systems and by telling other individuals that these systems are bad, that then we're all going to come together and do what exactly? Well, make good systems. Maybe, if that's how systems work. And in this process, I think, well, I'm reading this, I think what's crucially lost is this Christian anarchist perspective that God and truth himself were murdered by the Roman political system and the Jewish traditional religious system. And what you can take away from this is that political power and religious tradition are at the very least in tension with religious revelation and truth. And then from this Marxian perspective, systems work. They are abstract and to a large extent amoral, pragmatic, utilitarian. Both of these things are, I would argue, less pleasant to grasp than the idea that America was founded on white supremacy and the cops that exist now are really just a direct descendant of slavery, which we can couch in these moral terms. And this explains why she could write, "My hope is that Warren will apologize in the right way by speaking about the settler narratives that often erase indigenous identity, and that she will then build long-lasting relationships with indigenous peoples, because we need to see more stories of solidarity in our midst, a power to overcome systems of oppression and erasure." Because she believes that it's these stories. And the problem with how these systems exist is because we have these white supremacist stories that create the systems instead of the systems necessitate the creation of stories to create in-groups and out-groups. My third reason is that, frankly, she left out too many systems. So if you'll humor me, I would like to share my top 40 favorite, least favorite systems. And these include systems of reaction with a capital R, systems of inhumanity, systems of transphobia, of xenophobia, of Islamophobia, of systems of any kind of phobia except the good phobia of bad phobias, systems of anti-Semitism, systems of anti-Palestinianism, systems of neuronormativity, systems of parental authority, systems of too critical thought, systems founded upon false optimism, pessimism, cynicism, and or nihilism, systems that contest the power of Anglo-American liberal hegemony over the world, anti-democratic systems, democratic systems of atomizing individualism, systems of individual oppressing collectivism, systems of authoritarianism, systems of market domination, systems of irresponsible finance capital, systems of mass and targeted surveillance, systems of militarism and materialism, systems of false and destructive spirituality, systems of organized religions, systems of organized sports, systems of political gridlock, systems of vague language that, if it functions at all, hypnotizes people with doublespeak, systems of oppressive pseudo-left-wing language and theory, the production of which presumably mainly justifies the jobs of certain overproduced elites in the professional managerial class, systems that wither our imaginations, systems of thought control that rot our brains and hearts, systems of class warfare, systems that just aren't as nice as they should be, systems that I really don't like, systems that I don't necessarily understand all that well, but I intuitively feel like I don't trust them, systems of would-be pan-Slavic hegemony that explain how Trump got to be Führer for 4 years, and now why we should go to war in defense of the Ukraine or whatever, systems of systematic obfuscation, systems that exist primarily for the good of the system, systems of evil of any and all sorts, be they secular or metaphysical, systems of literature production that thought this book was a good idea. Whatever systems produce listicles and the trash articles on yahoo.com older relatives are always sending me. Systems of abuse that take up non-spatial spaces all over the world. But I digress. Suffice it to say, what it comes down to is that since her politics are just abstractly pro-BIPOC, LGBTQ+, she has no concrete notion of how economic/social reality should be changed that actually deals with material/political realities. Here's how she summarizes part 4, which is entitled Working. So this is the praxis section of her book. She sums it up by saying, Work, as it turns out, isn't always what we think it is. It is gift. It is writing letters and sitting in the sun watching a grasshopper. It is marching in a protest, or protesting by drinking morning coffee and being present to one another. In a world of workaholics, work isn't just about getting things done, but is its own kind of being, just as original man and the animals had to keep watch as the earth formed. Work is keeping watch, and keeping watch is work. Because what comes from that work is the fruit of a new thing, a new world, a new beginning. The asking, searching, finding, and working, it all leads us here, to a new way, to a better way, to a softer way. May we go. And this brings me to the fourth and final reason why her systems theory is so annoying. It's that because she doesn't have a systemic analysis, she can't come up with any solution, and she therefore defaults on taking responsibility to actually changing these systems. And in this again, she is a crude example of what 99% of us in society are doing. That the joke of this is we are all Kaitlin B. Curtice when it comes to this. Especially our elites that rule us and could theoretically change things in a way that you or I presumably can't. So let's run through it. If you're living under liberalism, if you believe, like 99% of us do, in individual rights, be they civil or human, in democracy, in secularism, in freedom of speech, in freedom of the press, in freedom of religion, and a market economy, i.e. capitalism to various degrees regulated by the state. If you believe that we're living at the end of history, a la the post-Cold War Fukuyama thesis, then, if we put our thinking caps on, what is the only possible solution to the problem that confronts individuals living in an unchangeable economic order? What unites views as allegedly disparate as Ronald Reagan and Barack Hussein Obama? I'll let you think on it.
Hey, I know the answer. It's education, right?
That's right. The answer is education. Because we can't change the system, but we can at least make smarter, more adaptable, more skilled individuals that will be able to make it in the system. Now, admittedly, Kaitlin B. Curtice would put it in a more vaguely uplifting way, and she wouldn't put it in that sort of detached sociological way or critical way, but she did put it like this. If we can return to the essence of our identities, we can teach the children around us to know who they are from a young age, and perhaps one day, when they are older, when they create the future, they will work together to change things and to heal systems we had no idea how to heal. And in the meantime, what Kaitlin Curtice offers is what she's doing to get back in touch with her, to create a better community, to create a better world for her children to grow up in. She does lay out over time the kinds of praxis, which is defined as the intersection of theory and practice that she does. She, as we've discussed earlier, is learning her native language with her sons. They occasionally attend powwows / ceremonial dances / tribal reunions. She suggests you can cut your hair in a traditional way if it feels right. She uses her tribal ID when going through TSA. She wears t-shirts declaring her identity, especially behind enemy lines like at a white evangelical church. She likes to cook indigenous recipes with traditional ingredients. She likes to prominently display her indigenous literature. She yells at people when they're acting/talking ignorantly in white supremacist mode. And then she also likes to yell at people, "It's not my job to educate you," after they ask you to educate them after you've yelled at them for acting/talking ignorantly. She believes in lecturing and telling stories abroad and hosting events at home, both to educate people. She believes we should do land and history acknowledgments. We should commune with nature, especially trees and small animals. And sort of her gold standard example is when she vicariously participated in the protests at Standing Rock over the Dakota Access pipelines. She writes that every day I would sit on our living room couch and watch live streams from my phone, from my laptop, horrified, surprised, but also coming alive to the realization that it has always been this way. History herself was coming to tell me that I belong to her, that I belong to all these stories that have been covered up in dust, covered up by whiteness. For the first time, I connected within my own experiences what it was like to face oppression. But I also understood that I was held secure within a spiritual and political movement that was carrying us all, a movement that had carried our ancestors. The truth is, the water protectors had voices, and they were using them. I thought about our tribe's prophecies, a vision of a time when young people will return to learn our indigenous ways and reignite the fires of our cultures and traditions. That being said, I think we've reached a good point to wrap up for the week, and I'll leave it up to you, the listener, to decide whether or not you find Kaitlin Curtice's perspectives on individuality and race and community and belonging and systems persuasive, and if you find it empowering that she felt that during the Dakota Access Pipeline Standing Rock protests that she knew she was held secure within a spiritual and political movement, whether or not you find that to be true, and that I'm a cynical bastard for thinking that, yeah, Kaitlin, that's what's holding you secure, not late capitalism, so you can sit on your living room couch and watch live streams on your phone and your laptop. And I'll also leave it to you to consider whether or not, if I'm right, to what extent are you or the people in your life doing similar things, imagining you're part of a radical protest movement or a force of positive social change, while in fact your whole way of life/lifestyle is directly at loggerheads with what you imagine you are achieving or about.